Historians have one of our favorite expressions, the past, the past is a foreign country. The Palestine Liberation Organization succeeded over the last 60 years in projecting the political coordinates of recent decades into the past of the 1940s and spreading around the world misconceptions about how the State of Israel was established. And in my recently published book, Israel's Moment, which I'm going to summarize for you today, I address those misconceptions. A central theme of the now widespread myths about the Zionist project was that it was a result of British and American imperialism. Related to this claim was the assertion that Zionism was a form of racism and that the State of Israel was a colonial settler project that was based on the intended expulsion of the native inhabitants of British Mandate Palestine. The Soviet Bloc, beginning in the 1950s, and we'll hear about that more in a moment, and the PLO, beginning in the 1960s, achieved a massive propaganda success in making these assertions which, in fact, reversed the realities of the late 1940s about who supported and who opposed the Zionist project and why they did so in the crucial years of 1945 to 49. But however remote the realities of the late 1940s, these false accusations against the Jewish state became and remained a central feature of anti-Semitism in the 21st century. Whatever else anti-Semitism may or may not be, it has always been a history of lies about the Jews. And some of these lies about the Jews became lies about the Zionists as well. At first, this set of assertions was a feature of political warfare in international politics, and then these assertions found a foothold in the academy. They amount to an ahistorical projection of the political views of the Palestine Liberation Organization and the Arab League back into the realities of the late 1940s. So what actually happened? The University of Maryland College Park is a campus within the famous Washington Beltway, 7 miles from the U.S. Capitol, and also 1 mile from the National Archives of the United States. And the National Archives of the United States hold the files of the State Department, the Pentagon, the Central Intelligence Agency, the Department of Justice, and other branches of the other elements of the executive branch of the United States government. So I'm enormously fortunate in not having to get on a plane or pay for a hotel to work in the National Archives. And the book reflects my own research there, as well as some research I won't talk about in as much detail in the archives of the French Foreign Ministry and the French Ministry of the Interior, and in the records of the United Nations, which are available to all of you on your computers. All of the General Assembly records are available, and many of the Security Council. So here are the 4 key points that I want to leave you, that I want to convey. While President Harry Truman's support for the partition plan and then the recognition of this new state was crucial, the support of the Soviet Union and the Soviet Bloc was even more consequential for the establishment of the State of Israel. This distinction was apparent in the diplomatic battles at the United Nations and in Communist Czechoslovakia's decision with Soviet agreement to violate the United Nations arms embargo on weapons to the Middle East and send weapons to the Jews before May of 48 and then to Israel in the summer and fall of 48. The Soviet bloc also facilitated Jewish emigration to pre-state Palestine when the British Navy was doing all it could to prevent it. The Soviet bloc policy was an effort of power politics to drive Britain out of the Middle East. But that power politics, as those of you who have read the speeches of Andrei Gromyko or Alfred Fedorkiewicz or Vasil Tarasenko know that power politics was also accompanied by the passions of anti-fascism and anti-Nazism and the fresh memories of the Holocaust. After the Soviet Union launched the anti-cosmopolitan purges of the early 1950s, the Soviet Union conducted a remarkably successful propaganda campaign that repressed the memory of the history of Soviet-era Zionism, and that era in world politics and in the Western Academy receives far too little attention, despite the fact that there's some excellent scholarship about it. Second, perhaps due to the understandable attention devoted to Truman's support for the UN partition resolution of November 29, 1947, and his recognition decision of May 15th of 1948, historians have not paid sufficient attention to the emphatic, resolute, persistent, and consequential opposition of the United States Department of State, the Department of Defense, and the Central Intelligence Agency, and their very close collaboration with the British Foreign Office under the leadership of Foreign Minister Ernst Bevin. Israel's moment presents more evidence that has appeared in the scholarship up to now about an anti-Zionist consensus, and by anti-Zionist I mean simply opposition to the establishment of the Jewish state, that emerged not only among the much-discussed Arabist diplomats, but a consensus that extended across the top of the United States national security establishment, led by former five-star general, now Secretary of State George C. Marshall, and then articulated by the most famous American diplomat of the 20th century, George Kennan, the director of the policy planning staff established in 1947. American and British diplomats and military leaders viewed the establishment of the Jewish state in Palestine as a threat to American and Western access of Arab oil resources, and as a huge opportunity for Soviet and communist expansion in the Middle East, and therefore the new Jewish state in the halls of power in London and Washington was viewed as a national security threat in the early months and years of the global policy of containment of communism. The British Foreign Office under Bevin's leadership was the vanguard of opposition to the Zionist project, a fact that the scholarship of William Roger Lewis, among others, and the contemporary political commentary of Richard Crossman illustrated at the time. But this was lost from view. The quote, imperialist opposition to the establishment of the Jewish state was lost from view in the leftist anti-Zionism of the past half century. In short, the establishment of the State of Israel had nothing at all to do with something called American or British imperialism, and on the contrary, at the time, it was understood by its supporters, and including in the 1950s and 60s by Nelson Mandela and others, as an anti-colonial project. Third, for purposes of this panel, very briefly, because there will be discussion about the Soviet Union, I draw attention to the leftist and liberal support for the Zionist project in the United States. Support for the Zionist project extended into something that no longer exists really in the United States called moderate Republicans, but there were some. But the leading figures were the architects of the New Deal and Social Security Act and National Labor Relations Act, Robert F. Wagner, the Democratic congressman from Brooklyn, Emanuel Seller. Wagner and Seller were emphatic, and so was the flagship of the American left, the weekly magazine The Nation, and its editor Frida Kirchway, the left-wing journalist I.F. Stone, and others who viewed the establishment of the State of Israel as a continuation of the anti-Nazism and anti-fascism of the Second World War, and who had fresh memories and made a big deal of it about the Nazi collaboration of the leaders of the Arab Higher Committee, Hashim al-Husseini, and others. Fourth, Israel's moment addresses the question of who was a racist and who was an anti-racist in 1947-48. And I draw attention to a speech that Jamal Husseini, a relative of the Grand Mufti and the representative of the Arab Higher Committee at the United Nations in 1947, a speech that Jamal Husseini gave here in London. In January 47, he gave the same speech in New York in September of 1947, and he denounced the Zionist project for 25 pages, the horrible Balfour Declaration and British colonialism and blah, blah. And then he said, the Arab world is a racial homogeneity that extends over the southern and parts of the eastern seaboard of the Mediterranean. The people of that vast territory speak one language and have the same history. The unity in all these matters is a matter of mutual understanding and solid foundation for peace. And he had referred to the Arab world as benefiting from what he called homogeneity in race. Homogeneity in race. And the introduction of a Jewish state would introduce an element of multi-ethnicity or multiculturalism, whatever phrase you want to use, whatever. And he was, so one of the successes of first the Arab Higher Committee, the Arab League, then the Palestine Liberation Organization, is to suppress the history of their own racism, or at least ethnocentrism, or resistance to a multi-ethnic, multinational, multi-religious Middle East, and project that sentiment onto the Zionists. Been enormously successful. The momentum for the Jewish state from 1945 to 1947, especially after the drama of the Exodus affair in July and August and September, momentum in American opinion, European opinion, parts of British opinion, was growing. And the United Nations established something that many of you are familiar with, the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine, UNSCOP, and it looked like UNSCOP was going to, as it did, offer a majority vote in favor of partition, that is, establishing an Arab and a Jewish state. And it's at this point in the summer of 1947 that Ernst Bevin speaks to the American ambassador in London, and that Bevin speaks with Marshall and says, we need to do something to stop this. Bevin had thought that sending the issue into the United Nations would be a slam dunk. No way would the Jews get a majority in the United Nations. So he wasn't nervous about it. Well, it looked like things were headed in the wrong direction. And then that leads to something called the Pentagon talks in September and October, which are a high-level meeting of military and diplomatic leaders that George Kennan and Lloyd Henderson gather in the Pentagon. And the purpose is, what does containment mean? What's the containment of the Soviet Union mean for the Middle East? And what it means is two things. One, defense of the British position in the Middle East is synonymous with American national security interests. And the defense of the British position meant exclusion of a Jewish state in Palestine. So it was not in the national security. And so the book summarizes a great deal of memos and very in communication at the highest levels of the State Department and the Pentagon this is an Anglo-American consensus emerges by October, and then comes the partition resolution, and Truman, who one of his benefits is that he wasn't from the Ivy League, so he wasn't impressed by all these people who said it would be a terrible idea. And there have been other books written about why Truman did what he did, but he did what he did. And at that point, Kennan and Marshall and Henderson and others says, oh my goodness, we've got to undermine the partition resolution. This is a disaster for American national security policy. And then Kennan writes some very eloquent, typically brilliant Kennan memos in January and February of 1948 as to why the establishment of the State of Israel would be a disaster for Western access to oil, and it would be a huge boon to the Soviet Union just at the time when we're trying to contain the communists and send more oil to Western Europe to reconstruct the continent at the early months and years, days of the Cold War. The anti-communist argument in Washington and London in the summer and fall of 47 and then the spring of 48, the anti-communist argument was an anti-Zionist argument. So Harry Truman just got fed up with the fancy pants in the State Department. He took policy back into the White House, said, you guys are not going to make policy for me. But he was dealing with the most famous military leader of the Second World War, George Marshall. He was dealing with George Kennan, the most brilliant diplomat in the State Department for decades. He was dealing with James Forrestal, the the chief of the Secretary of Defense. He couldn't fire them all. He couldn't fire them all and start the containment of the Soviet Union and launch the Cold War. So there was only so much a president is powerful, but there's only so much a president can do. And one thing that Harry Truman could not do was to say to the State Department and the Pentagon, send weapons to the Jews. That's what Ben-Gurion, Moshe Shertok, they were making. We need weapons. The Arab states exist. We need weapons. And so the question, Emanuel Seller and Wagner and I.F. Stone and Frieda Kirchway, the liberals and the leftists in Congress and in public opinion in the United States, send them weapons. That's what they need. They don't just need our nice sentiments. You know, I mean, all this is one thinks of Zelensky and all that. But there wasn't Biden and Blinken there making decisions. So they didn't send them weapons. And when the war began, then the Security Council was debating things. That's the Anglo-American Alliance. That is Secretary Marshall, and that's Ernst Bevin at the United Nations. This gentleman here is Vasyl Tarasenko, and that's Andrei Gromyko. Warren Austin is there. Excuse me, I'm in a brain freeze about the name of the British diplomat. The terrible thing to do in London. But they're debating the plan of Count Bernadotte, the Bernadotte plan of summer 1948. And the Bernadotte plan would have amputated the Negev desert from this new state of Israel. And there's Tarasenko, who Mr. Putin accused the Ukrainians of being Nazis. There's Tarasenko and Gromyko, and they're fighting with Austin and the British against the Bernadotte plan. And those UN records are just, they're very compelling and fascinating. Again, that's a history that the Soviet Union succeeded in suppressing. An anecdote by conclusion. When it was all over, in May of '49, Truman had appointed a man named James McDonald to be the first ambassador to the State of Israel. And McDonald was he was unapologetic about his support for the Zionist project. He knew Ben-Gurion, he knew Sherrod. They were on first-name basis. And after the war, the State Department was pressuring Ben-Gurion to bring the Arab refugees home and to accept smaller borders than had resulted as a result of the war. And Ben-Gurion said to McDonald, and they got the president to send a letter. If you don't do these things, we're going to have one of those agonizing reappraisals in Washington about our relationship with the very new Jewish state. And Ben-Gurion said to McDonald, you know, and they added, after all we've done for you, after all we've done for you. And so Ben-Gurion said, we're very grateful for all you've done for us. Tell the president I'm very grateful for his support for a petition and support for recognition. We know how difficult it was. But the partition resolution was never implemented. And the United Nations didn't send armed forces in order to implement it. And when we needed weapons, you didn't send them. And then Ben-Gurion said to James McDonald, if we had had to depend upon you, the United States, we would have been exterminated. Ben-Gurion emerges, in my view, from the book as one of the greatest political figures of world history in the 20th century, who had built a very small state, but had a remarkable sense of timing. And he understood that Israel's moment would last only as long as Stalin decided to make a bet that the new Jewish state would be pro-Soviet. But that moment was very brief because the imperialists were not happy about it, and the anti-imperialists were in it just for opportunistic reasons, at least for Stalin. And he seized that moment when there were doubts about whether or not they should declare a state. It was a very decisive moment. So Israel's moment, anti-Semitism in the 20th century, and I now just last conclude, rests in part on a set of misconceptions about how the state of Israel came into existence. And I have done all I can do as a historian to try to restore that past as a foreign country and bring it to the attention of this splendid conference that's dealing with the long 20th century and anti-Semitism in the 21st century. Thank you.